In 1979, AC/DC recorded a song called Highway to Hell. Bon Scott brought the song to life with his rough, powerful voice. It became their biggest hit at the time and finally got them into the American market. But 7 months after the song was released, Bon Scott was found dead in a car outside a London apartment. Reports claim he died from alcohol poisoning. But here's what most people didn't know. Atlantic Records had been threatening to fire Bon for months before his death. They thought Bon wasn't fit for the band. To prove he was the best, he drank as much as he could and no one stopped him. And this raises many questions. Did Bon Scott drink himself to death trying to prove something? Or did AC/DC and the music industry push him toward that ending? AC/DC started in Sydney, Australia in 1973. Brothers Malcolm and Angus Young formed the band with one goal: break out of Australia and conquer the world. Australia had about 13 million people back then, roughly the size of Texas. The local market was tiny. Real success meant making it internationally, which meant America. They signed with Atlantic Records in 1976. Atlantic was a major label that already had turned Led Zeppelin into global superstars. They knew how to sell hard rock to American audiences. But getting signed to a major label came with a price that most musicians never talk about publicly. Record deals work like this. They give you a contract. Let's say they pay you $1 million to make 2 albums. It sounds like a great deal, but that money is just a loan. The label then spends more money on recording your album, paying producers, setting up your tour, paying for airplay, and getting you interviews on major platforms to promote the album. All these production, promotion, and marketing expenses, plus travel and accommodation to all the events you need to go to, can be very expensive. The label pays for all of them, but then adds the cost to your debt. You won't see a penny from your music until the label is paid back in full. Most bands spend years trying to pay back their label before they see a single cent of profit. The label owns you until the debt is cleared. This was AC/DC's predicament in the late 70s. By 1978, Atlantic was getting impatient. AC/DC had released several albums, but none of them cracked the American market the way the label wanted. They had a cult following, but Atlantic wanted mainstream success. They wanted the band to work harder, tour longer, and deliver better songs. The pressure reached a breaking point when Atlantic told the Young brothers to fire their older brother George Young as producer. George had produced their earlier albums and helped shape their sound, but Atlantic wanted a different direction. They wanted someone who could make AC/DC sound more American, more polished, more commercial. Malcolm and Angus agreed to work with Mutt Lange, which meant their brother George stepped back as producer. He wasn't fired, he was moved aside as the band tried to break through on a bigger level. But Atlantic had another problem with AC/DC. They wanted Bon Scott gone. Atlantic executives, mostly Jerry Greenberg, complained about 2 things. First, Bon's voice was too rough and too Australian for American radio. Second, his lifestyle was out of control. He drank heavily, showed up to recording sessions hungover, and partied harder than anyone else in the band. Atlantic saw him as a liability and reportedly told the Young brothers to replace him. Malcolm and Angus refused. Bon was their singer and their friend. They told Atlantic to back off, but the pressure never stopped. The label kept pushing for a breakthrough album, and the band kept pushing themselves to deliver. They created a toxic cycle. Everyone started drinking more to cope with the stress, and Bon Scott, trying to prove he belonged and could handle anything thrown at him, pushed himself harder than anyone else. During one of these endless tours, Angus Young joked about their lifestyle. They were constantly on buses, constantly on the road, constantly exhausted. He said they were on a highway to hell. The band laughed because it felt exactly like that. Malcolm looked at Angus and said they should write a song about it. So they did. They brought in producer Mutt Lange and started working on what would become their most important album yet. The title track would be called Highway to Hell, a joke about their brutal touring life that was about to become something much darker. AC/DC operated like a military unit. Malcolm and Angus ran the band with strict discipline. They fired drummers constantly. If you missed a beat during a rehearsal, Malcolm would stop everything and make them play it again. Former drummer Chris Slade later said in interviews that Malcolm ran rehearsals like a drill sergeant. Perfection was the only acceptable standard. This created a band culture built on toughness and proving yourself. You had to show everyone you could handle the pressure, handle the touring, handle the lifestyle. Everyone in the band drank. That was standard for rock bands in the 1970s. But drinking became a competition in AC/DC. Who could party the hardest and still perform the next night? Who could drink the most and still show up for rehearsal? Bon Scott always made sure he won that contest. Angus Young was the exception. He stayed mostly sober and focused on his guitar playing. But Bon, Malcolm, and the rest of the band dove into the party lifestyle head first. Bon just dove deeper than everyone else. Understanding why Bon partied so hard requires looking at his past. He was born in Scotland in 1946 and moved to Australia with his family when he was young. He got in trouble early. Theft, fights, the usual rebellious teenager stuff. He spent time in a boys' home and dropped out of school. By the time he was 20, he was playing in local bands and living rough. When he joined AC/DC in 1974, he was already 28 years old. Most frontmen were in their early 20s. Bon had already lived several hard lives before AC/DC even existed. By 1979, AC/DC was finally breaking through in America. The Highway to Hell album was their best-selling record yet. It hit number 17 on the Billboard 200 on November 10th, 1979, spent an impressive 83 weeks on the chart, and went on to sell 7 million copies in the US. Atlantic Records was thrilled. The title track became a rock radio staple. The band was on the verge of massive success. But the tour schedule was brutal. They played over 100 shows across Europe, the UK, and North America. The touring never stopped because Atlantic wanted to capitalize on the album's success. Bon handled it the way he handled everything. He drank more. He pushed himself past exhaustion because stopping meant admitting he couldn't keep up. And admitting that would mean proving Atlantic Records right when they said he was a liability. The band watched him spiral, but nobody intervened. Malcolm and Angus later admitted they saw the warning signs. Bon was drinking more than usual. He looked tired, but in their minds, Bon had always been like this. He'd survived decades of hard living. He'd bounce back like he always did. Except this time, he wouldn't. On February 19th, 1980, Bon Scott spent the night at a club called the Music Machine in Camden, London. He was with a friend named Alistair Kinnear. They drank for hours. Bon was celebrating the success of Highway to Hell, or maybe just drinking because that's what he always did. By 3 a.m., Bon was completely wasted. Kinnear made a decision to drive to his own apartment in East Dulwich instead. When they arrived, Kinnear tried to get Bon out of the car and up the stairs to his apartment, but Kinnear couldn't carry him. He was exhausted from the night and probably drunk himself, so he made another decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He left Bon in the car, reclining the passenger seat, covering him with a blanket and cracking the window. It was a cold London night, which explains the blanket. Kinnear then went inside his apartment and went to sleep. The next afternoon, Kinnear went back to check on Bon. He was still in the car, in the same position, but Bon wasn't moving. Kinnear opened the door and realized Bon wasn't breathing. Kinnear called an ambulance. They rushed Bon to King's College Hospital. The doctors tried to revive him, but it was too late. Bon Scott was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was acute alcohol poisoning. The coroner's report stated that Bon had choked on his own vomit, a common way people die from drinking too much. The report also noted death by misadventure, a legal term meaning accidental death caused by your own actions. Bon Scott didn't intend to die that night. He just drank like he'd done hundreds of times before. His body finally gave out. The news reached Malcolm and Angus while they were in London, and it left them devastated. Bon was invincible in their minds. He'd survived car crashes, bar fights, and decades of hard partying. How could he just be gone? Malcolm later said in interviews that they kept asking themselves if they pushed Bon too hard. Did they see the warning signs and ignore them? Should they have stopped him from drinking so much? Angus felt the same way. They'd all watched Bon drink himself into oblivion night after night. They laughed about it and called him a legend. Now he was dead, and they couldn't stop thinking about all the times they could have intervened but didn't. AC/DC without Bon Scott made no sense. He was the voice, the personality, the front man who made everything work. But Bon's family stepped in. His parents, Issa and Charles Scott, told the band that Bon would have wanted them to continue. He would have wanted them to keep making music. The band decided to move forward, but they faced a massive problem. How do you continue after losing your brother? How do you make an album that honors his memory without exploiting his death for profit? The band held auditions for a new singer. Brian Johnson from Newcastle, England stood out. He'd been in a band called Geordie and had a powerful, raw voice similar to Bon's. Bon Scott saw Brian Johnson perform and liked his singing, and later told Malcolm and Angus about him. The band believed it, and that gave them permission to move forward. They entered the studio in April 1980, just 2 months after Bond's death. Malcolm and Angus wrote the music, Brian Johnson wrote the lyrics. This detail matters because conspiracy theories still circulate claiming that Bon Scott wrote songs for Back in Black before he died. Some people claim the band had secret recordings of Bond singing these tracks. None of that is true. Back in Black was written and recorded after Bond's death as a direct response to losing him. The album is a mourning record disguised as hard rock. The cover is completely black with no photos and no text on the front. Angus Young later confirmed in interviews that the black cover was intentional. It was a funeral color, a sign of mourning, a tribute to Bond. The opening track, Hell's Bells, starts with the sound of church bells ringing for over a minute before the band kicks in. It's a funeral ceremony in audio form. Brian Johnson's lyrics talk about rolling thunder and being taken down. The song is about death and loss. The title track, Back in Black, reveals the album's true purpose. The lyrics talk about being back, but dressed in black. The song celebrates survival while acknowledging the death that brought them to this moment. You Shook Me All Night Long sounds like a party anthem on the surface, but the lyrics describe someone who lived wild and couldn't be controlled. That's Bon Scott in a song. Have a Drink on Me is the most direct tribute. The lyrics are literally about raising a glass to someone who's gone. It's a toast to Bond, disguised as a drinking song. Brian Johnson said in interviews that the band wanted Back in Black to celebrate Bond's life rather than wallow in sadness. They wanted the album to feel like Bond was still there in spirit. Back in Black was released on July 25th, 1980, 5 months after Bond's death. The album sold 50 million copies worldwide and became the second best-selling album of all time behind Michael Jackson's Thriller. AC/DC went from a cult band to global superstars overnight. But conspiracy theories followed the album's success. Some people claim that the band timed the release to capitalize on sympathy for Bond's death. Others said the album was too good to have been written so quickly after such a tragedy. The theories ignored the obvious truth. Malcolm and Angus Young had been writing songs their entire lives. They poured their grief into the music. That's why Back in Black sounds so powerful. The album's massive success created a strange legacy. AC/DC achieved everything they'd been working toward, but the cost was Bon Scott's life. The breakthrough album they'd been chasing for years only happened because their frontman died. That reality haunted the band for decades. So, did AC/DC kill Bon Scott? Bond died from alcohol poisoning. He made the choice to drink that night. Nobody forced the bottle into his hand. But the culture around him created the conditions that made that choice inevitable. Atlantic Records pushed AC/DC relentlessly. They threatened to drop Bond if he didn't change. They demanded hit songs regardless of the personal cost. The label treated the band like assets on a balance sheet. Malcolm and Angus Young, desperate to save their band and their careers, created a culture of extreme toughness. Bon Scott, trying to prove he could handle anything, took that culture to its logical extreme. He gave everything to AC/DC: his voice, his energy, his health, and ultimately his life. Bon Scott's death created an album that still connects with millions of people decades later. That's the power of real human experience in music. But AI is making songs now too. Can it ever create something that carries the same emotional weight? We cover everything in our video comparing AI to award-winning songs. Watch it to see if technology can ever replace the human soul in music.